Okay, thank you for the introduction. My presentation, like she mentioned, is going to be in English. Trying to learn both Portuguese and Spanish at the moment, but I'm still very early. But anyway, my talk today is going to be about building scalable back-end solutions for performant applications that aren't really targeted at Web3 people, but they're just targeted at any general user. Because I kind of believe, coming from the traditional tech world, that and obviously a lot of other people agree with this, that we just need to build high-quality applications. The value proposition can't be that they're built with blockchains, because most people just don't care. I think that we care because we're interested in this technology, but to kind of get to that next step, we just need to build better applications and have a better value proposition overall. So this is a talk about how we've built some type of solution for our social protocol called Lens. So this is going to be a combination of what Lens is, along with the technical details of what we built, how it works, and things like that. Also kind of a history of some of the things that have happened in social, not only in the blockchain space, but also in general. So if you want to have resources for this talk, you can check out this QR code. I'm going to show this again at the end of the talk. This has a link to the Lens documentation, has a link to some of the GitHub repos and the code bases that I'm going to be showing you. It has tutorials and things like that, as well as a link to our grants program. If you're interested in applying for a grant, we have a generous grant program for people building on Lens. And my name is Nader. I'm the director of DevRel at Aave. I've been a software engineer for 11 years. I've been doing education on the side or full-time for about 8 of those years. And I've worked in the traditional tech world for 8 years, and then I've only been in this blockchain space for about 2.5 years. The last role that I had in the tech world that wasn't blockchain, I was leading developer relations at AWS for the front-end web and mobile team, which is kind of like a full-stack team dealing with cloud technologies and client-side SDKs, mobile SDKs. So to talk about the protocol and the upgrades that we've made, I want to talk about social in general and kind of like why this technology and why we built it in this way, and what Lens is, and also what Web3 social is. So what Lens is, it's essentially like if you talk to a user, you might say, oh, it's the social layer of Web3, or it's a social network, or it's a layer where people build social applications on top of. But speaking to developers, this is kind of a better definition, in my opinion. A protocol and a suite of tools and APIs for easily building social applications or for building social features into existing applications. And I just remembered I have this clicker, so I don't have to be standing in front of this computer. Okay, so that's Lens, but what is Web3 social? Because Lens is essentially kind of in this category, but now we're trying to break out of it just being Web3 social. Because I think that being social is something that people don't realize is integrated into almost all applications. And Web3 social just brings new characteristics and new value propositions, hopefully that make the experience overall better, that doesn't necessarily need to be kind of scoped down to only Web3. Why social? Well, if you look at DeFi and if you look at a lot of the use cases that we're building today, there are not that many people that are interested in them. In fact, if you look at how complicated a lot of DeFi is, staking and lending and borrowing and having to deal with wallets and all this stuff, private keys and seed phrases, you know, the average person is going to get very lost. Even technical people like ourselves still have challenges with a lot of this stuff. But with social, there are almost 5 billion people in the world. That means out of 10 people, like 7 or 8 of those people are using social networks. That means we don't really have to explain this use case. It's something that people use every day. And when we think about social, we don't realize it, but a lot of applications that we use every day have social features or social components. So GitHub, for example, is something that we probably use every day, but people don't think of it as a social application, but we use it as a social application. When you create a profile, you enter your information and people can follow you. And when you make updates, those updates get shown on a feed. And there's a recommendation algorithm of some sort maybe that shows people content based on who they're following on GitHub. I use that as a way to find alpha for new just new apps and stuff and new things that people are working on. If there's someone that I follow that's really, really sharp, I will keep a list of those people just by following them on GitHub. And then whenever they star a repo, when they create something, it shows up in my feed, and then you can get a very fast look at things that are happening in real time. So a lot of these types of things happen in a lot of applications that we don't consider social applications, but they have social features. So Web3 social specifically doesn't really have like a specific term that is defined. So I created this term with my own, help, along with some asking a bunch of people and getting their opinion. So Web3 social platforms and applications built using blockchains, decentralized networks, and token-based economies rather than centralized platforms. So what is the value proposition? Why would anyone care about this? Well, I think that you have all of these different characteristics that we have built in with Web3 that we can just tack on and make additional enhancements to the existing social experience. So one of those things is a portable social graph. If I leave one application on a protocol like Lens, I can actually go to 20 other ones and have all of my followers, and I don't have to rebuild my social graph from scratch. If I decide I want to start creating videos, I don't have to now start from zero on TikTok. I can just go to a video app on this protocol, and I already have my 20,000 followers, and they're already there. You have client diversity. You have recommendation algorithm diversity. With Twitter, you literally have one recommendation algorithm that's shoved down your throat. You have no option to choose a different recommendation algorithm. They do that because they want to monetize and they want to kind of capitalize on your emotions and you. But with these social protocols, because all the data is open, theoretically you could build out dozens of recommendation algorithms. No one had really done that before, but we're now starting to see that actually happen. If you go to Lenster, I will maybe demo this in a moment, you have 20 different recommendation algorithms or so that you can choose from. And then when you visit the app, if you don't like what's being shown to you, you can just say, hey, give me this new recommendation algorithm. And you now have a new feed of content that's shown to you. You have direct financial relationships enabled with tokenization. So I can put a bounty like I did yesterday on a post and say, hey, I'm going to give $100 on this post. Anyone that retweets this gets $1, but you must have 1,000 followers and you must meet X, Y, or Z on-chain criteria. And then that way you don't have to actually connect with anyone. You just have this content that's out there. When someone retweets it, the token goes directly from I would say a smart contract into their wallet, and there's no middleman required. There's all types of stuff that's happening right there in that general area as well. That's pretty exciting. Now for developers, this is where I get excited. What is the value proposition for developers? Well, a lot of it has to do with just the same things that we have with all blockchain technologies. Shared, public, open, immutable infrastructure that anyone can build upon, and anyone can also compose and build composable additional applications on top of that. You also have this idea of kind of like a serverless type of infrastructure. The reason that the things that I was working on at AWS became successful is because we were focusing on serverless, meaning that developers didn't have to spin up and create all of these things from scratch. If they wanted a backend, they didn't have to go create an entirely new backend from scratch. They could just spin up a serverless function and do a database call really easily. If they wanted authentication, they didn't have to roll their own auth. They could use something like Amazon Cognito. If they wanted a database, they could use something like DynamoDB that will auto-scale to hundreds of thousands or even millions or tens of millions of operations per second. And they didn't have to deal with scaling up or down. This was managed infrastructure, and developers really like that because you don't need to deal with all that shit on your own. With Web3 social, you have similar infrastructure focused for building social applications. You don't have to build a DevOps team. You don't have to roll and update and deal with your own database, your own authentication and identity and access controls. Everything is there for you. So therefore, you only need a front-end team to build out high-quality applications. We have teams that are raising millions of dollars of a single developer are building these high-quality applications because you just need less people because there's just less work to do. I'm going to show you an app that I built 2 hours last night using ShadCN, which is a really nice UI library that I've been interested in, along with Wallet Connect, along with some of our SDKs. All of these are really like abstracting away a lot of the work that we used to have to do in the past, so you're able to rapidly iterate and rapidly experiment. And this is kind of another value prop, easy experimentation. In the past, if you wanted to build a social network, you might have spent 2 years. And then when you finally launched it, it flopped. Therefore, people are probably not going to try that again. You know, you spend all this time and money and effort, and then you can't get users. Well, guess what? What if you could build like a prototype in a few hours and therefore try new things? And if it fails, it's not a huge deal. You didn't invest a lot of time or money. And then built-in user base, that's another problem when you're building a social network. It's often really hard to bootstrap that user base. But if you have a protocol, every single user that's ever signed up for any application in that protocol is now a user. You now have hundreds of thousands of users, millions of users growing every day, and then you don't have to start from scratch. You're kind of tapping into that. I want to pivot for a second. This is Adam Mosseri. If you don't know who Adam Mosseri is the head of Instagram. He's also the head of Threads. He gave a talk in 2022 in the TED Talk. It was called A Creator-Led Internet Built on Blockchain. You don't really think of Instagram or Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg and blockchains in the same sentence, right? But Adam Mosseri is Mark Zuckerberg's right-hand man. And what they rolled out a few months ago was an application called Threads that you're probably all aware of. Threads is now kind of taking a lot of the ideas we had in Web3 and applying them. And if you kind of look at some of the talking points he made in that talk and see what they did with Threads, you start seeing that he's actually implementing a lot of the ideas that we know and love in Web3 and blockchain to what Threads is. For an example, in this talk, he said, "What does it cost you? You're beholden to each platform where you show up. You're playing by their platform, that platform's rules." He was talking about kind of some of the challenges and the trade-offs to using a social network, because you're kind of signing up. You spend years on a social network, and then you're kind of locked in. Something happens, you don't like it, you can't leave. You're there. You're beholden to that platform where you show up. His first post on Threads, or one of his first posts on Threads, was this. This has to do with kind of decentralization. And this is specifically speaking about ActivityPub, but he's talking about the complications that come along with the decentralized network. Where have we heard decentralized network before? Obviously, like, you know, this is the shit that we've been working on for a long time, and I'm like not even here as long as a lot of you all. You all have been here for a lot longer than me even, right? But decentralized network, like when has Facebook ever talked about decentralization, right? If you're wondering why this matters, here's the reason. You may one day end up leaving Twitter, or Threads in this case, or hopefully not, end up deplatformed. Censorship resistance, portable social graph, we're talking about a lot of the things that we've been talking about for a long time. If that ever happens, you should be able to take your audience with you to another server. Being open can enable that. Jack Dorsey, another social founder, has been talking about decentralization, censorship resistance a little bit longer. And his initial post around, I would say this isn't actually the one I was thinking of. Anyway, this is another post by him. If you go back and look at the initial post when he launched Blue Sky, it's very interesting as well. He said there are only 3 truly censorship-resistant technologies that scale today: Tor, Bitcoin, and Nostr. Nostr is actually the 3rd social network that Jack Dorsey has worked on. He obviously started Twitter. He then was a very huge part of Blue Sky, and now he's a large part of Nostr and has kind of left Blue Sky. So as of right this second, the 2 biggest social founders in the history of the world are building decentralized social. Mark Zuckerberg's team, Jack Dorsey's team, and him. So I think that's really interesting, first of all, and I think it's a huge validation for a lot of the things that we all have been working on. There are, though, some trade-offs to some of the approaches that they're taking. I think Nostr is a much better approach in general, obviously, than ActivityPub. ActivityPub is not truly, like, you don't truly own your data. It's not truly censorship resistant, but it's a step in the right direction away from a centralized database and a centralized server. So we can at least give him that. And then let's talk about another person. Tim Berners-Lee is building something called Solid. He's been doing this for a long time. And this is essentially another attempt at kind of some type of decentralized web, decentralized network. So it's cool to see like a lot of these innovators that have had a lot of success like moving in this direction. And I think that it comes slowly, but people are kind of realizing a lot of these important value propositions. But the challenge is, how do we actually get there? How do we build this stuff to be scalable while holding on to the censorship resistance, immutability, and permanence, and all of the things, the characteristics that make up Web3? And that's kind of what my talk is about. When we look at why the choice of ActivityPub, by the way, because ActivityPub isn't as good as a decentralized technology like a blockchain or even something like a decentralized storage network like Arweave, because they still have control over the identity layer and things like that. But for them, it makes sense because it's kind of a hybrid approach. So I think the general idea is like decentralized social like is here in a lot of different ways, not only from Web3, but from Web2. That's the direction that they're moving. But the question at this point is, how do we build it? So if you ask the average person, they might say blockchains, but I don't think so. I think blockchains in the way that they are today are just a very poor choice. And we'll talk about why right now. And when I say blockchains, I'm talking about blockchains whose main purpose is to prevent double spend. Because there are other types of blockchains, I would say. So when I worked at AWS, we had a database technology called DynamoDB. DynamoDB is what runs Amazon, and at one point, a single application was hitting around 100 million operations per second. This is Amazon Prime Day. This is the day that everyone's on Amazon, and it's having a lot of scale and all that shit, right? This is a single application using a single cluster of databases. Blockchains, though, as they exist today, to be quite honest, for the most part, only scale to a few hundred, or if we're lucky, a few thousand transactions per second. So in addition to blockchains being not as performant or as scalable, they're also shared state. They're also shared infrastructure. Polygon or Solana or Ethereum, whatever, I mean, we're getting better with L2s and all this stuff that I won't go into, obviously, and even I think app chains are a huge step in the right direction, which would kind of take that entire argument away about them being shared. But they're sharing all of this limited resource between thousands of applications, each with hundreds or even thousands of users. So instead of a single database in Web2 dealing with 100 million operations per second for a single app, you now have a shared database sharing thousands of apps, sharing thousands of users, so it's orders of magnitude less scalable. And the reason that they can't scale to social TPS, which needs to be in the range of like 50,000 transactions or operations per second, if you kind of look at what Twitter's highest load is, it's for a lot of different reasons. We have shared block space, which again is getting better now with app chains and things like that we're moving in the right direction with a lot of the modular stuff. But one of the main challenges having to do with the way that traditional blockchains operate are having to do with the storage. So storage is extremely expensive, but we're like, I would say, we are not really using it, but the idea would be to build a social network would be to use a blockchain as a storage mechanism, which again doesn't make sense, because imagine if Twitter, when 100,000 extra people jumped on during the World Cup or whatever, that it started costing extra money and the block space started becoming more expensive, and then like you have this limitation that you just should not have for just storing data, storing arbitrary data. So the idea would be like, when Twitter, imagine if your app stopped working because a bunch of people started using it. It shouldn't work that way, essentially. And the bottleneck, again, is blockchain storage. It's much more than storage, though, because it allows your state to be executed with other contracts. So if I build a smart contract, like on Aave has a smart contract, other people can essentially build smart contracts that interact with that, and you now have this composability, which is extremely important. But it might not be that necessary for me storing a post. Like, why does it matter if my friend stores a post and I store a post that the entire network comes to consensus that I posted first and he posted second? It doesn't really matter. What does matter is immutability, censorship resistance, the data being public and open. Those things are important. You don't need to prevent double spend in a social network. So what is the EVM at its root? Because most of the applications that I've worked on have been EVM. It's essentially a big state machine. But one of the interesting things about the EVM is that you do not have to actually pay money to simulate a transaction. You only have to pay money to execute a transaction. So this idea of using the EVM in a way that only simulates hasn't really been thought of, I would say, or I would say in the way that I'm about to kind of present it, and at least to our best knowledge. But anyway, so the expensive part of dealing with blockchain's storage is paying the cost to update the state, and therefore all of the other applications having that ability to then transact and interact with the current state of that network or of that smart contract. And the EVM is trustless. When you generate an address, it generates a public and a private key, and you now have this that you can interact with it. The private key is used to sign transactions and prove that you have access control to do so. This is essentially the identity, authentication, and authorization layer that you might consider a Web2 alternative to be. And essentially, when you do a contract call on something like an ERC20 token to transfer, you're signing the transaction with your private key to prove who you are. But what you can actually do is, again, using all of these same primitives, you can actually just simulate all of these things that they would happen without actually making them happen, therefore not having to pay that cost. So if you're able to simulate all of this, what would you end up doing with the actual storage? Because you still need to store the state somewhere. So again, the EVM is the history of state and off-chain keys to prove that you can do something. The history is all of the updates and all of the things that have happened over the course of time. It only forces you to pay when you want to change the state. It does not charge anything to simulate if anything could have happened at a certain point in time. So what you can then essentially consider doing is using the EVM as a simulator, using a less expensive network as a storage layer. So that's essentially what we've done with the new infrastructure that we have. And what we are using is a combination of Arweave and bundler network. Arweave is a blockchain-like structure that is made only for storing data. It's not made for any other things like financial transactions or anything like that. It's also been around for a long time. It's been around for 6 years, and it's been functioning correctly. Arweave is kind of slow, though. So if you store something on Arweave, it takes like 10, 15 minutes, I think, for the transaction to finalize, and therefore it's not a good use case directly for something like what we're doing. But there is another protocol that has been built on top of Arweave. It's essentially what you could consider a roll-up on top of Arweave. And it's called Bundle Network, and it allows, at this moment, around 50,000 transactions per second, and 8 millisecond finality. And the cost of a transaction on Bundler Network is around 0.0003 cents for arbitrary text of like a decent amount of size, what you might consider a post on a social network. So what our new infrastructure essentially is, it's called Momoka, and it's combining simulating the EVM transactions on-chain, posting them to Arweave, and then you now have this kind of new hybrid infrastructure that allows you to scale these types of applications and our testing over a course of a few minutes at peak around 35,000 transactions per second, but theoretically a lot more than that. The idea is this: you have two new pieces of infrastructure that have been introduced. You have a submitter and a verifier. The user signs a transaction like they typically would. It goes to the submitter. The submitter essentially simulates that transaction on Polygon, and then it submits the transaction to the data availability layer, which is Bundler Network and Arweave. We then have a listener on the verifier. The verifier could also be thought of as kind of like an indexer. When a transaction comes through, it verifies that that transaction is valid. If it is, then it will say, okay, this transaction is valid, and therefore it should be used in your application. If it's invalid, then you essentially discard it, because there is no like anyone can post to Arweave, anyone can post to Bundler. So the verifier is there to kind of verify whether the transaction is valid or not. And then an additional security like check that you can do on the client if you would like is to make sure that those proofs are correct. But essentially the two new things that have been brought in are the submitter and the verifier. So with Momoka, the user still owns all of their content. It's not possible to action a Momoka transaction if you're not the owner of that data or that wallet. And because Bundler supports like the EVM, it allows you to kind of use the same everything that you would have in the past, all of the same APIs, libraries, and SDKs, and even the wallets and stuff like that. And what we've seen so far is that our new infrastructure is around 350 times less expensive and around 350 times more scalable than we previously had. So the last time that I checked, we had around 500,000 transactions, and the total cost was around $175. So for 500,000 transactions, you have a cost that sometimes would be a single transaction on Ethereum at high peak, right? Peak usage. And at 0.0003 cents a transaction, you're around 300 times more expensive than something like DynamoDB, but 300 times more expensive than DynamoDB is actually pretty cheap considering that DynamoDB is like, I think for every million transactions, it's around 25 or 50 cents or something like that. So with that being said, these are the stats of our previous versus our kind of new infrastructure. For 100,000 transactions, it would cost around $10,000 in the past. Now it would cost around $40. And if you want to say percentage terms, 250,000% cheaper, along with it being a lot more scalable in terms of how much we could handle. So if we wanted to process 100,000 transactions, we can do that in 2 seconds, where in the past it would have taken almost 1 hour. What I would like to do now is just demo this. So everything that I've talked about is completely open source. So we have Momoka here on GitHub. Oh shit, it's not working, is it? Let me see if I can just mirror my screen. All right. Okay, we have this kind of working. Okay, so this is Momoka on GitHub. You can go to GitHub/Lens protocol and you can see Momoka. Everything here is all that you would need to run a verifier yourself and just kind of look at how all this works. I'm also going to go ahead and run Momoka because what Momoka is going to essentially do, it's going to go ahead, I'm running a verifier. It's just going to go ahead and start listening to any updates that come through. You can start at the very beginning of the chain and index all of the transactions that have happened and verify those, or you can start where we currently are right this second, and that's where we're going to start here. So when we run this, it's going to go ahead and kind of set everything up, and we're now listening for new transactions. So what I'd like to do now is maybe post the transaction and see it come through, both here as well as the Momoka Explorer. So I'm just going to take a quick selfie here. All right. And I'm going to go to Orb, which is a Lens app. And I'm also going to open up the Momoka Explorer here because this should have the transactions coming through in real time as well. All right, I'm going to upload this picture. Okay, so if this works, it's still uploading now, but if it works, it should say orb and then nader.lens in about a few seconds. There it goes. So there's the transaction there. And if I go to a Lens app like Lenster or something like that, I go to my profile, then hopefully we'll see that post there. That's pretty cool. And that's kind of the main demo I wanted to show. And I'm going to show one more thing though that kind of dives more into the developer experience and the composability and like the developer velocity that you might get if you're building with one of a protocol like Lens. So this is an app that I built last night to kind of show today. Like I wanted to build as much functionality as I could in about 2 hours or until I fell asleep. So I built this app and it took me about 2 hours. This is using ShadCN, it's using Next.js, it's using Wallet Connect, and it's using Lens SDKs. So this is a pretty decent looking app for it to be done in just a few minutes. So what you can do is you can kind of like click on a profile. This will open up in whatever Lens app that you like here. So I might open this up in Lenster. You also have the new Wallet Connect v3, which is pretty nice. Got this working in about 5 or 10 minutes with their new SDK. Anyway, so okay, yeah, we're getting done on time, but anyway. So that's just the demo I want to show there. I'll send a link out and let people check that out, open source. So that will go ahead and wrap up my talk. So if you have any questions or you want to learn more about Lens, come find me. I'm going to be hanging out here all day today and the rest of the day tomorrow as well. It's kind of late for the bounties, but we're participating in the Build-a-thon. We have bounties for Lens as well as for Aave. So if you have any questions for your app, if it hasn't been submitted yet, I don't know, come find me. So thanks for coming to my talk.